Hello, good afternoon, and welcome to the Middle East Forum's weekly podcast series. My name is Cullom, and I will be moderating today's discussion. We're pleased to be joined today by Victoria Coates, who is the Vice President of the Kathryn and Shelby Cullom Davis Institute for National Security and Foreign Policy at the Heritage Foundation. And she joins us today to discuss her latest book, The Battle for the Jewish State: How Israel and America Can Win. Dr. Coates will speak for 15 minutes, followed by a 15-minute Q&A session from the audience. And if you'd like to ask a question, please feel free to use the Q&A function or the chat window inside of your browser. And with that, I will turn the discussion over to Dr. Victoria Coates.
Well, thank you, Anif, and all of my friends at the Middle East Forum. This is a great opportunity to talk a little bit about why I wrote The Battle for the Jewish State: How Israel and America Can Win. It has a foreword by my former employer, Senator Ted Cruz. We can talk about that a little bit as well, because this topic just quite frankly isn't going away. I decided to write the book in April of 2024 and submitted it for publication in September. It was sort of a cri de coeur, if you will, of what I had experienced since the October 7th attacks, but not limited to that time frame, because the intensity of events both around the attacks and subsequently, had me reassessing a lot of my assumptions, my preconceived notions, and particularly about academia and what was happening here in the United States. And the sort of big moment of clarity for me is that this was not just a war on Israel, that it was certainly an Iranian-funded and fueled attack on the Jewish state, but that's just the little Satan. And the big Satan is the United States. And if you're attacking what you consider to be Satan, you don't stop when you get the little one. Your big goal is the big one. And so I was very struck by how much of this activity was happening in the United States. So essentially, the book is designed to answer the four questions I started getting over the course of the months after October 7th. The first one being, how did we get here? I think most Americans are correctly really concerned by what's been revealed here on the streets of the United States immediately after the attacks, as if they were waiting to reveal themselves, particularly but not limited to campuses, and the kind of anti-Semitism that is rife in this younger generation. I mean, there was recent polling that overall the American people do not hold anti-Semitic views to the tune of about 75%, and that's good. But in the youth demographic, I think it's 18 to 27, the percentage that do hold anti-Semitic views is 60. So it's more than half. So that is a shocking thing. I delved into some of the curricula that are being taught at our major universities, notably my alma mater, the University of Pennsylvania, and these peer-reviewed Cambridge University sanctioned articles that are being curated for syllabi are essentially accusing Israel of being not only racist and imperial, but illegal. And this is what's being taught in the law schools. And so if you are an undergraduate and you've been told three of the worst things for you to be on this planet are racist, imperial, and illegal, I mean, how can you not draw that conclusion about Israel when it's presented that way? And then at the same time, by extension, the United States is next on that list with those three characteristics, almost uniquely on the planet. The other one is actually Australia. But Australia has been one of the most pro-Palestinian places on the planet with their March for Humanity last month, and the Prime Minister announcing his recognition of the Palestinian state at the United Nations General Assembly later this month. But then they just had to kick out the Iranian ambassador to Australia, the first time they've done such a thing since World War II, because the IRGC, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, are active in Australia fomenting anti-Semitism, attacks on kosher restaurants, attacks on synagogues. And they had overwhelming proof of this, and it was going to be published, and that's the only reason the government took the action that they did. But that's who these folks are coming for. It doesn't matter if you're pro-Palestinian, because the Palestinians aren't the point here. The point is the Iranian regime wanting to destabilize Western democracies, and they're using anti-Semitism as a tool to do that now, increasingly blatantly. So that's really the material in the first chapter. There's also some in there about the kind of useful idiots in the Biden administration. When I wrote the book, the election, of course, had not been decided. And so one of the purposes was to kind of lay out the track record. What had the Biden people actually done after October 7th? The president presented himself as this great hero of Israel, but he turned out to be something quite different. And one of the things I found particularly interesting, sort of a story from that, was when the president took his trip over to Israel in the weeks after October 7th, which was, a courageous thing for him to do, and it was very well received. But he said in his remarks, his public remarks, that Israel should not imitate the mistakes after 9/11, that Israel should not react, in a kind of knee-jerk way, and that we had made errors, and that had led to the failure in Afghanistan, which was, of course, such a blot on his presidency. And having worked for Donald Rumsfeld and gone through the lead up to the Afghanistan campaign in some agonizing detail, that wasn't the case. If we all think back now, almost 25 years to 9/11, there were weeks and then months that went by after the attacks, and everybody was screaming at the president, do something. And he has famously said, they will hear from all of us soon. But it took a while for the Pentagon to get ready to do the invasion of Afghanistan, which was an absolutely brilliantly managed kind of impromptu horseback original attack, which was extremely effective and absolutely what we should have done. And so it was interesting to me to look at that with some hindsight and see how President Biden was really manipulating that history to try to pressure Israel into doing what he wanted, which was to essentially come to a ceasefire and a deal that accommodated Hamas. So that's sort of the first chapter. The second chapter is answering the question of why is Israel the partner of choice for the United States in the Middle East? And I think it is a perfectly legitimate question for Americans to ask. That many billions of dollars have been invested in the relationship with Israel. There is a security exposure to it. So why? Why should we do this? And I think those of us who support the relationship do ourselves a disservice by not making, the answer to that question clear, or making people feel stupid for having asked. So that chapter delves back into history a little bit, goes into the so-called Judeo-Christian values that were fundamental to the creation of the United States, what those actually are. There are those who question if they even exist. They do. And, they are the foundation of both of our countries, both in concept and in legal code and in moral code. So we go back to that, then moving more into the present day and the foundation of modern Israel, the successive presidents who have managed that relationship for good or ill. President Reagan plays a very strong role in this as the president who established the Memoranda of Understanding between our two countries, which outlines the security relationship. He also initiated the intelligence relationship, the missile defense relationship, and signed our first free trade agreement with Israel, which I always think is a wonderful thing. And then coming up to the present day, a little bit of what President Trump did, what I participated in the first Trump term, particularly the maximum pressure campaign on Iran, but then also the very pro-Israel actions, the moving of the embassy, the recognition of the Golan Heights, for example, and then the legal codification of the settlements in the West Bank. So that's chapter 2. Chapter 3 is there an alternative to Israel? And there are, of course, two. There are the Palestinians and the Iranians. And there has been a long bipartisan and I would say undistinguished history of outreach to try to make the Palestinians into something they're not. And so that chapter goes into a fair amount of detail about who the Palestinians are, what the history of this is. And it was my conclusion that essentially in 1973, when the Arab nations surrounding Israel decided that attacking Israel had been expensive and painful and that they weren't going to do it anymore because they didn't like losing, nobody sent that memo to the Palestinians. And so the Arab nations went on this trajectory that led to the 1979 peace deal with Egypt, then Jordan in the 90s, and then the Abraham Accords in 2020. And the Palestinians remained mired in the mid-70s because they were used as a kind of domestic political sort of valve of release for anti-Israel sentiments, all became focused on this Palestinian cause. And the problem is that the Palestinians aren't a nation and never were, and predictably did not develop any of the what you might think of as the trappings of modern statehood, any institutions that could function, could serve the Palestinian people. They never did any of this. They had to have their bespoke United Nations agency, UNRWA, to do that work for them, and UNRWA did it corruptly and poorly. But they could never summon their own organizational skills because it's not how they're structured. And so, that has turned into just a doom loop of failure. I think what's about to happen at the United Nations at the end of this month with the recognition of a Palestinian state is going to be emblematic of this, because it is utter farce. It is a show. It is theater to make these countries like Canada and the UK and Australia feel they're virtue signaling about their commitment to the Palestinian cause. But it's not going to feed a single person in Gaza. It's not going to do anything material to improve conditions in Judea and Samaria. It's going to simply encourage the Palestinians to keep resisting, because they think eventually somebody's going to come along and wipe out Israel and give them their state, which we know is not the case. Israel is a highly successful modern nation state. The Palestinians are not. And so that is a real ongoing challenge for all of us, but a very important point, I think, particularly this month to make. Then with the Iranians, the absolute failure of diplomatic outreach to Iran is obviously well documented. I strongly supported President Trump's decision to get out or cease compliance, rather, with the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. I think that was absolutely the right course. That was a failed, bad deal. He identified that very clearly early on and was correct in that. And then, we saw the outcome after he was reelected and, tried to engage the Iranians diplomatically, gave them every chance. And when they, were trying to string him along and play for time, he took the decisive action that he took in June and, decimated their nuclear program once and hopefully for all. But that was a very interesting trajectory to trace as well. And then finally, the question was, what's next? And, as I said before, when I wrote the book, I didn't know how the election was going to come out. I had my hopes, but no knowledge of it. And so it was a, kind of a guessing game between what we could project a Harris policy would be, which would have been, I think, the most overtly hostile to Israel in history, and then what a Trump trajectory might be, which of course we would think would be very positive for Israel, as it has been. And as we go into kind of the end phase of this war in Gaza, and hopefully the return of the remaining hostages, it is my hope that we can find some new paths forward. Things like the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, run by my friend Johnny Moore, to stabilize that situation, to work on rebuilding and then see what might be possible going forward. But the main thing is that for both American and Israeli and broader audiences to recognize that this is a battle both on Israel, a war on Israel, and a war on the United States, and ultimately for Western civilization. And that's what they're coming for. And so just in conclusion, as I mentioned, the introduction is written by Senator Cruz, and he focused on what's happening in academia here in the United States. And after that extraordinary testimony, and I believe December of 23, just months after October 7th, when we had the presidents of Penn, Harvard, and MIT go up to the Congress and testify, and their inability to call the river to the sea a genocidal comment, their inability to identify anti-Semitism on their own campuses, how carefully they had been coached, how lawyerly they seemed in the face of impassioned questioning. And so that was after that. Elise Stefanik and Senator Cruz, both of whom are Harvard grads, wrote a letter to the university demanding the ouster of the president. And so he talks very passionately about that in the introduction and framing it then as this issue that the United States has to confront. We can't say it's something far away, just has to do with Jews in the Middle East. No, it has everything to do with what we want to do and the society we want to have here in the United States. And all of this, for me, was intensified in the summer of 24 when Prime Minister Netanyahu came and addressed the Congress. And we here at the Heritage Foundation, of course, sit on Massachusetts Avenue going down to Union Station. And we had all the protesters come by in their thousands and yell at us and yell at our security guards and generally be unpleasant. And they went down to Union Station and they dragged down those flags, those iconic American flags from in front of the station, and they burned them and they put up Palestinian flags. Those weren't Israeli flags. We watched American flags be burned, in one of our great civic monuments here in Washington, D.C. So if that wasn't a wake-up call, I don't know what was. And so here at Heritage, we have a couple of initiatives. Project Esther, which you might have read about in the New York Times, they don't like it. And then our plans for the U.S.-Israel alliance that we're going to do to carry on the work that was in my book and build out toward the 100th anniversary of the U.S.-Israel alliance. So that's my book spiel. I'd be very excited to answer some questions.
All right. Many thanks, Victoria. We do have a number of questions coming in here, and I will begin with one from David Levine, who asks, the Trump administration appears to understand many of the points that you've made in your book. What happens if we're facing a Kamala Harris or similar administration after 2028?
Well, David, that is, literally the $1 million question is, and I think the race that will be most interesting to watch will actually be the Fetterman reelect, which is also in 2028 in my home state of Pennsylvania, because Senator Fetterman has, of course, been an outspoken champion of Israel and critic of the anti-Semitism that has been revealed here in the United States. And if he gets primaried and loses potentially in Pennsylvania, they're already talking about it. That is going to be a very clear signal that this has become a deeply partisan issue. And, then it has to be a campaign issue. And you have to ask people, do you condone this? Is this the America you want to live in? Is one in which this is tolerated, if not openly accepted as, it's okay to be an anti-Semite? And it was interesting. Harris really foreshadowed that a year before October 7th when she was down at George Mason and a pro-Palestinian student, stood up and asked her why she was funding genocide. And Harris thanked her for sharing her truth. Like, no, you're saying this is an acceptable view instead of giving a little history lesson about why it's inaccurate. So very big issue for 28.
All right, thank you. Now, Barry Werner asks, perhaps another $1 million question. Do you think the world will allow Israel to destroy Hamas?
Well, I don't know that the world is going to have very much to say about it. When you have an American president, who made, I think, a good faith effort yesterday to say, here is a deal, Hamas. I mean, Hamas could have ended, A, Hamas could have not started this in the first place, but B, they could have ended it on October 8th by surrendering and giving the hostages back. And they have never done that. And despite the fact that the strip has been categorically destroyed. The Palestinian people are suffering, but Hamas doesn't serve them. They don't care, and they have neither the will nor the means to resist Hamas. So this is entirely on Hamas, and it is their fault. And I think the president tried to give them another deal yesterday. They've clearly said no. And the president said, okay, that's the last offer. And the tacit threat there is, I'm just going to support Israel going in and finishing this. And so in the face of that, I don't see anybody really being able to do much about it. I mean, the Europeans will wring their hands and moan and clutch their pearls and generally, be unpleasant at the UN. But what are they going to do materially to prevent it? And so I would see the actions of a country like Spain, which is doing some very noxious things, as the outlier, because you're not even seeing the Arabs do stuff like that. And the Abraham Accords have endured. So I don't think there's if the prime minister and the war cabinet take the decision to absolutely eradicate Hamas, as I said, I don't think there's much to be done.
All right, thank you. Now I'm going to a question from Curtis Rankin, who asks, do you think that the Biden administration prevented a quick Israeli conquest, or was it the fear of losing the lives of the hostages if the IDF advanced too quickly?
I would embrace the and there, Curtis. I think it was both of those things. I mean, it has been agonizing to have to deal with the hostage crisis, knowing what those people are going through. I've met with the families a couple of times. Obviously, the prime minister's meeting with them all the time. And they would do anything, as we all would, to save our loved ones from that kind of horrible fate. So that's always been, a balancing act. But on top of that, then part of this is in the battle for the Jewish state, all the times that the Biden administration put restraints on Israel, urged restraint, don't go into Rafah, don't do this, don't do that. And every time when Israel did it and it proved successful, they were proven wrong. But, if you had a President Trump in place, I am 99.999% sure this wouldn't have happened. I've talked to my former Israeli counterparts about it. We all know where the flashing red lights would have been, and we actually talked to each other. So I'm pretty sure that we wouldn't have had this situation if we had, and you had an American president who was saying from the get-go, give all those hostages back, and your option to survive is to surrender. I think Israel could have wrapped this up much more quickly.
Many thanks. Going now to a question from Judith Klinghoffer, who asks, could you address the strategy of positioning Israel as the intransient side in any negotiation?
Yeah, that's always befuddled me as well, Judith, because Israel is the one that constantly makes concessions, gives land for peace, releases thousands of prisoners for one Israeli prisoner, and is deeply concerned about international perception and reputation, which Hamas is not concerned about in any way, shape, or form. And so, for Israel to be the one that needs to be pressured to do something after what happened on October 7th just makes no sense. But it's this inversion of David and Goliath, where Israel is actually the David, and this savage global anti-Semitism and anti-Western force is the Goliath. But somehow it's been reversed. And Israel, as I was talking about in the first chapter of the book, is perceived as being, imperial and the big bully on the block. And it's just, it's part of this construct. And I agree it's utterly illogical, but it's one of the reasons I wrote the book, was to try to point that out.
All right, thank you. Now, Adam Pector asks, do you think that the Republican Party will eventually abandon Israel if Jewish voters continue to support Democrats, both with their votes and with their money?
I actually don't think that's the case, because I think there are a lot of practical, deeply conservative reasons to support Israel beyond the Jewish vote. Now, you could make an argument that in Pennsylvania in 2024, Jewish communities around Philadelphia and Pittsburgh were part of the reason President Trump won Pennsylvania, because a lot of them did shift, trended much more Republican than they had historically. And those are areas where the Democrats have to, I'm sorry to keep reverting to Pennsylvania politics, but it's what I know. You have to take those certain number of counties by a certain percentage of the vote. And if you don't, you're going to be offset by the middle of the state, by Lancaster County and that kind of area. And that's what they faced. And I think that was a shift in that vote. And on top of that, the sorts of things that conservatives champion, like a strong defense, like border security, these are all things that are exemplified by Israel. And Israel's been a great partner to the United States. So I forgot about that. That's in the second chapter, just the list of all the things the United States has gotten out of this relationship, because I don't think that's talked about enough. And so, if you look at the Congress, the Republican caucus in the House, you essentially have two Republicans, Tom Massey and Marjorie Taylor Greene, who are pretty openly anti-Israel for various reasons. But the whole rest of the Republican caucus is absolutely with Israel. And if you look at the Democrat caucus, they have two or three who are with Israel, and the vast majority of them are virulently anti-Israel. So I think for that reason, the Republicans will, you're going to have a few who hold their views. I don't agree with them. It's their right as Americans. But the vast majority of Republicans, I think, will continue to support Israel.
All right, many thanks. This is kind of a long one, so bear with me here. An anonymous attendee asks, the Red-Green Alliance, in the form of Democratic Socialists of America, or DSA, being aligned with Islamists has never been more clear. What do you think it would take for Democrats to move away from DSA? You mentioned John Fetterman being the litmus test, but do you think the Democratic Party needs to do more to move away from this part of their party? And shouldn't both parties be concerned with the growth of groups like DSA?
Oh, absolutely. And there is a infiltration of DSA by radical Islamists. And we actually will be having Senator Cruz here at Heritage on Wednesday to discuss his new legislation to designate the Muslim Brotherhood, which is behind a lot of this, as a foreign terrorist organization, something he and I worked on 10 years ago. I'm sorry we haven't gotten farther faster, but we are still making progress. And, I think that is a really noxious nexus, and most obviously impersonated by Mamdani in New York. And you put a kind of a slick face on it, and it looks good. But we start peeling back these policies, and it's literally the devil for our country. And that's very much what I mean by, this is a battle for America too, and it's a battle we have to win. Now, I wish the Democrat Party would do more, but I think the fact that it was so unpopular, in the last go-around, these are not policies the vast majority of Americans actually like. Now, the lunatics in New York may elect this person, but that's New York. That's not America. And so I think as with a number of other issues, President Trump is kind of laying a trap here where you're saying you're in favor of genocide against Jews. Like, that's essentially where you're coming out here. It's like the folks who are running around so concerned about the civil liberties of the narco terrorists that were eliminated outside of Venezuela recently. I mean, they're not Americans. They don't have constitutional protections. You don't want to have that argument just from a political standpoint, but that's what they're doing, and I think they're falling into a similar trap here.
All right, thank you very much. Now, we've unfortunately reached the end of our podcast for this week. I want to thank you again for taking the time to join us and to tell us about your book.
Well, no, thank you all very much. I really appreciated the discussion.
Absolutely. Now, again, the title of Dr. Coates' book is The Battle for the Jewish State, How Israel and America Can Win. Now, is there somewhere where you would direct our viewers if they want to follow more of your work?
Sure. I mean, heritage.org, we all have our landing pages with our op-eds. I have one in Fox News today about the situation in Australia. And then on X, I'm at Victoria Coates.
All right. Many thanks. And for our viewers, I will put a link to purchase that book, as well as a link to the Heritage Foundation in the video description below. As always, I thank you all again for your participation and your viewership, and I hope you all have a wonderful day. Thanks.